Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the birth narratives of Jesus in our continuing study of the life of Christ. First of all, when we talk about the time of the birth of Jesus, we ought to recognize that the way we reckon time, 4 BC and 1 BC and 2014 and whatever dates we're using, this is a relatively new reckoning. It was brought about by Pope John I in 525 AD, by the way we reckon time now, and he commissioned a change to be made. Now already what was happening is that they were using the common way of figuring date was AUC, that is from the founding of the city of Rome. And Rome had been founded in what we call 753 BC. And so they said, no, let's not use that. Now there was another way that was used. It was there were some that were reckoning days by the reign of Diocletian. That was sort of cumbersome too. He said, why don't we change our calendar and we'll reckon time by the time of the birth of Jesus? And so the attempt was made, but it looks like the fellow who put that together, he missed it by several years. And the reason we know that is because by the way we reckon time now, Herod the Great dies in 4 BC, in 750 AUC. And like I said, they seem to have missed it by a few years, and Jesus probably was born maybe just shortly before that, maybe early 4 or 5 BC, maybe a bit earlier, but we don't know exactly. The death of Herod, as we said, is 4 BC. He had began his reign. He had been declared king of the Jews by Rome in 40 BC, but if you remember when we talked about that, he was given a Roman legion, and it wasn't until 37 BC that he actually regained control over Palestine, as the Romans like to refer to it. And then he dies in 4 BC, which means that Jesus is born somewhere in the middle of that. And Josephus mentions a lunar eclipse prior to the death of Herod. And that helps us to pinpoint that 4 BC. It helps us to figure out exactly when that took place. So that Luke begins, and I'm bypassing right now for the purpose of our study the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist. That takes place in Luke chapter 1. But Luke chapter 2 begins. Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. We know him in history as Octavius. That was his given name, but he had changed his name when he found that he was, at the death of Caesar, he found out that he had been made the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and so he changed his name to Julius Caesar. And so we refer to him as Caesar, and then his title Augustus. And a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, at this point, we have a historical issue. And that's regarding the census of Augustus. You see, this is Gaius Octavius Augustus. Now, that's how we refer to him. We're trying to contrast him with Julius Caesar. Although remember, he had actually taken the name Gaius Julius Caesar, and that's what he called himself. And then Augustus was the additional title. This was Augustus, of whom he had actually said, I found Rome brick and left her marble. He took the Roman Empire and turned it into a real empire, not through force of arms, but through administration. And part of his administration was things like this census. Under him we have what's known as Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, where Rome is largely, not completely, but largely at peace once he has secured the empire. Now there's some problems, as we said, with this census. Quirinius, we know, was governor of Syria from 6 to 7 AD, and that's much too late for the birth of Jesus, if the birth of Jesus takes place while Herod the Great is still alive. And there is no earlier recorded census of which we are aware. Now, we have to remember that when it comes to history, we don't have the entire story. We're always finding new things and new elements that weren't mentioned somewhere else. But we do not have any earlier recorded census. And there is no known census known to us while Quirinius was governor during this period of 6 to 7 AD. However, there are some proposed solutions. Some I think are good and some probably not so good. It has been suggested that the passage can be translated to read, "This census was taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria." I don't think that's a good suggestion. You have to force the Greek a bit where it doesn't really want to go. Another proposed translation reads that this census was given before that, which was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. I don't think that's a good solution either. It's true that the term that Luke uses to describe him as governor is a general one. And Luke often speaks in these sorts of general terms. He might refer, for example, to Herod Antipas as a king when technically he was a tetrarch, just a ruler of a fourth part. Wasn't technically a king, but we use it in a general sense. And so he says that this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governing Syria. And that actually might help us, because there was discovered the lapis Tiburtinus. It's a tombstone, and it records the achievements of an unknown governor. A governor who served as propraetor of Syria on 2 different occasions, and we don't have any records of anyone serving as propraetor of Syria twice, because our records are incomplete. There's no record of any governor of Syria who served in that position on 2 different occasions. And Quirinius, we know, was there at an earlier date. He was commanding the legions in Syria after 12 BC. So he was in the right place. He was exercising authority. He was, can I say it this way? He was governing. Did he have the actual title? Maybe he did. And maybe we just don't know about it. So I submit that Luke might have been a better historian than our records allow. And I think this is exactly historically correct. Well, we go on to read that Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Now, the way we look at maps, he's moving from north to south, and we would say he's going down, but they're talking about uphill versus downhill, and if you're going to Jerusalem or to Bethlehem, you're going uphill because it's up on a ridge. And so he went from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child, and where that child came from we would have had described in the previous chapter. And while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, oftentimes in a Christmas story, we sort of look at that phrase, there was no room for them in the inn, and we think in terms of Howard Johnson's and Hilton hotels, and they didn't have inns that were quite like that. In fact, the word that's described in, the word for inn here, is the same word that later on, when it comes time for Jesus to eat his Last Supper, he will use that same term there to describe not an inn, but the upper room. There was no room for them in the guest room. After all, if you're going back to Bethlehem because that's where your family ties are located, then you would expect to find some place, not in a Howard Johnson's or Holiday Inn, but in the guest room, in the additional room of your family. The problem is that all the families are coming back, and there's just no room. And so he's laid in a manger. That's not necessarily in a stable, because in the ancient world, you would house your animals in the downstairs part of your own home. But he's placed in the manger. in that downstairs part, there might be family all around, but there's no real room to put this little baby, and so they put him in a manger. Now, I want to take you to Bethlehem. Bethlehem's on a high hill. There's a picture from the top of the city looking down. And nowadays, Bethlehem is sort of spread out over a wider area. In that day, it would have been sort of crowning the top of this hill. You can go to the Church of the Nativity, it's called. And nowadays, notice you actually had in this picture a large gate, but the Crusader knights they had a tendency to ride their horses right into the church, and so they took and they walled up the gate so that to go into the Church of the Nativity, you have to bow down, whether you realize it or not. And you go inside, and it's rather ornate, and I don't know that Jesus was really born necessarily at this exact location, but he might have been, and that commemorates the birth of Jesus. Back then, it would have looked very different, probably a home of rather humble origins. And in the same region, there were some shepherds staying out in the fields and keeping watch over their flock by night. Now, the shepherds would not have been right there in Bethlehem. They would have been out away, because you don't want sheep eating the crops. So they'd actually be, maybe the general region, but across the valley and maybe across a few valleys, out in the fields. And an angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. They were not ready for this. Suddenly, they see a manifestation that's just incredible. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid." Sometimes I think angels are instructed, whenever you talk to a human, first thing you got to say, don't be afraid. "For behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which will be for all the people," not just for the high and the rich, but even for shepherds. "For today in the city of David," that was Bethlehem, "for today in the city of David there has been born for you a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." Now that word Christ, that's the Greek way that you say the Hebrew word Messiah, means the anointed one. And that has implications, because there was promise in the Old Testament, this one who would come, who would be the anointed one, anointed with God's Spirit, who would be the Messiah, who would do something special for God's people. And here he has been born for you a Savior who is Christ, and not just Christ, Christ the Lord. "But this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths." That's what you would do with babies. You wrap them all up and nice and warm. But here's the strange part. And notice both of these are given the sign. He's going to be wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. Now, when we picture mangers here in the United States or in Europe, since we live in places where there's lots of wood, we usually make our mangers out of wood. Feeding troughs made out of wood. There's not a lot of wood in Israel. And going through Israel, I had the opportunity to see a number of mangers, and every one of those mangers was always, every one of those feeding troughs was always made not out of wood. You wouldn't use wood on something like that because wood's far too expensive. You would make them out of rock. You would hollow a rock out, and that would be the feeding trough for the animals. There's a picture in Bethlehem, actually. Oh no, I'm sorry. This one's in Nazareth. Of a baby. There's no baby in it, but of a manger, a feeding trough for animals. And here's the sign for the baby Jesus, who's going to be the Savior. He's wrapped in cloths, lying on a stone slab. Think about that imagery. Think of what that is a sign, because a sign points to something. You see him now, and then at the end of the story, at the end of the book of Luke, we're going to see Jesus once again, wrapped in cloths and lying on a stone slab. Because that's what he came to do. He came to die in our place. But not to stay dead. To die and then to rise again. And so they see a sign that is a picture of what he came to do, what he came to accomplish. This will be a sign for you. You'll find a baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. Here's a picture of another manger. This one's over in Megiddo, but lying on a stone slab. Now, Matthew's account versus Luke's account. In Matthew's account, we read of the announcement to Joseph. Luke's account in chapter 1, if we had gone back and read there, we would have seen the announcement to Mary. In Matthew's account, there's a brief mention of the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, and then we read about the rest of the story, about the Magi and things like that. In Luke's account, the birth is seen in Bethlehem and the announcement to the shepherds. And then Matthew's account follows the birth narrative up with the visit of the Magi from the east taking place evidently a bit later. Now, I don't think it was years later, but maybe more in the area of a few weeks. And then Luke's account mentions after this, maybe not after this, but it mentions the dedication of Jesus in the temple at the age of about 5 weeks. He'd be 40 days old, and he would be taken to be dedicated in the temple. Now, I think those two accounts can be merged together and harmonized. Let's look at it this way. We have the birth of Jesus, and how old is he? Well, he's not even a day old. He's born. And then Luke mentions that on the 8th day he would be circumcised. Now, you don't need to go to a temple or anywhere. That could take place right there in Bethlehem. And after 40 days would be 41 days, Mary and Joseph present Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. And then sometime after that, in fact, it might have been that very evening or the next day. But after 41 days, we have the Magi who come to Herod, and they're looking for the king of the Jews, and he's going to send them to Bethlehem. And then after that, there will be a call to go out and find that baby and put him to death, but he will have escaped down to Egypt. Let's look at the story. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, talk about how Magi from the east arrive in Jerusalem. And if you went east of Israel, you have to go across the desert first, you had the kingdom of the Parthians. These were the arch enemies of Rome. And Magi, when you say Magi, that's just not a pretend people. That's not like a once upon a time there were these magical people. But the Magi, we know something about them. They were an ancient order of priests from Parthia. And furthermore, they were monotheists. They believed in one God. And one of the duties by now of the Magi is that it was their duty to appoint the kings over Parthia, just like, beginning in 800 AD, where the Pope would put the crown on the head of Constantine. So the Magi would actually put the crown, they would appoint the king of Parthia. That was one of their religious duties. And here they are coming now to Jerusalem to appoint a king. These are the same Parthians who had fought Herod the Great in 40 BC and had driven him from the land, and against whom he had to come back and take the land with the power of Rome behind him. And here they are back again. Now, there's not armies of them, but we're not told how many there are. We're told Magi from the east. Sometimes we think in terms of 3 wise men, but the Bible never says there's 3. It just says there's 3 gifts. And they're coming back, but they're coming back from Parthia. And when Herod hears about this, we read in chapter 2, verse 3 of Matthew, he was troubled. And when Herod got troubled, all Jerusalem got troubled with him, because Herod could do some bad things. Herod was known for doing some very terrible things. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to inquire of them where the Christ, where the Messiah was to be born. And they knew the answer to that. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. Now they're quoting Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. That was the prophecy. So they knew where the Messiah was supposed to be born. He was supposed to be born in this little tiny village just south of Jerusalem, about 4 miles south of Jerusalem, known as Bethlehem. And then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star had appeared. A star had appeared. It's been noted that there was a conjunction of planets a few years before the death of Herod. Did this have anything to do with the star? I don't know. But it is interesting to note that there were things that were taking place in the sky that were rather unusual, that would have, maybe been seen as of special significance. And Herod finds out when the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, that I too may come and worship him." Now, he didn't want to worship Jesus. He wanted to put Jesus to death. This is a plot. He is pretending to be one thing when he is really quite another. And they go on their way, and they come to Bethlehem. And having heard the king, they went on their way, and lo, the star which they had seen in the east went on before them, until it came and stood over where the child was. That doesn't really sound like a conjunction of planets. That sounds like something a bit more. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And they came into the house. Now, that doesn't mean that, he's not still lying in a manger. I mean, he could have been, or maybe there's more permanent dwellings. Can't really say. Because they come into the place, the house, and saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And those are very valuable gifts, but also gifts that are rather unusual to present to a baby. Gold speaks of king. Frankincense, the incense idea, sweet-smelling things that are used for worship, speak of his ministry of a priest. And myrrh. Myrrh was also a valuable commodity, but it was used, among other things, it was used for burial practices. Perhaps speak to his death and sacrifice on our behalf. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod. Now, this picture that we're looking at is actually from Bethlehem. I'm standing on the hill of Bethlehem and looking, in this case, to the south. South of Bethlehem, there you see that thing in the distance that looks a little bit like a volcano. It's not. It is not a natural protuberance. It is actually the ruins of a fortress called the Herodium, one of the fortresses of Herod, who had this chain of fortresses all throughout his land to just sort of keep an eye on things. And here they are under the shadow of Herod's fortress. But they are warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, and so they departed for their own country by another way. And they escape the clutches of Herod. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. And this isn't the first dream he's had. We see where he had been given a dream earlier about who Jesus really was, here in Matthew's account. And the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise and take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." And Joseph does that. Here's another picture of that Herodium, that fortress. Actually had a big built-in swimming pool down below. That fortress of Herod's, known as the Herodium. And Herod seeks to murder the child, and we read that Joseph arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, "Out of Egypt did I call my son." Now that's a prophecy from Hosea that is actually doesn't really appear to be a prophecy when you read it in its context. It looks like it's talking about Israel. But that's the very point. The things that are true of Israel would also be true of Israel's Messiah, including the fact that he comes out of Egypt, just like Israel came out of Egypt. And when they had performed everything, this is after they come back into the land. And by the way, this is Luke's account. Notice I've switched from Matthew over to Luke. Luke doesn't mention anything about going down to Egypt. He's not focused on that. Doesn't mention anything about the Magi. But Luke instead speaks to us about how when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. And Jesus now grows up in this another little village. Bethlehem was a little village, but there's a village up in Galilee, the village of Nazareth. The picture here you're seeing is of there's some folks that were in Nazareth that they took a section of Nazareth. Nazareth today is sort of a larger city. Back then it was a little village. And what they did is they restored it to what it would have looked like in Jesus' day. If you ever go to Nazareth, you've got to go to Nazareth Village. Wonderful place, and they've done a wonderful job to show you what it would have looked like in the first century when Jesus was there. Now we have another narrative in Luke. Luke chapter 2 verse 41 talks about how when Jesus was 12 years old, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And so they're going to go from Nazareth. And when he became 12, that's when Jesus became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning after spending the full number of days, you'd go for Passover, but then you'd be there for the week of unleavened bread. After spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan. And went a day's journey, maybe mom figured he was with dad, and dad figured he was with mom. And they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. They realized, wait a minute, we lost Jesus. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem. They had gone a whole day's out, so now they have to go back a whole day. And then after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions, because that's what you did. Not in the temple proper, but in the outer courts of the temple. That's what you did in Jewish learning. You would listen, and you would ask, and you would answer, and it was sort of a question and answer format. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Here's this 12-year-old boy. And yet there's something about him that even to these teachers of the law is striking. And when they, that is Joseph and Mary, saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said to them, "Why is it you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house, in my Father's place, in my Father's temple?" You see, Jesus already at the age of 12 was aware that he had a different sort of father. Yes, Joseph was his adopted father, but his real father was God himself. But he goes down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. That's the refrain that you continue to see through the early chapters of Luke, because this is seen from Mary's perspective. And Jesus, for his part, kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So he grows up in Nazareth until the time comes for the beginning of his ministry. But we'll talk about that next time.